Hi everyone, welcome to this talk hosted by the Emergent Nonfiction Lab. Today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Erik Reichborn-Kjennerud, who holds a PhD in War Studies from King's College London and an MA in Security Policy Studies from the George Washington University. His research interests include contemporary Western warfare, war and technology, military theory, and operational thinking and practice, critical IR theories, and science and technology studies. Today, he'll be discussing his new book, The World According to Military Targeting, published by MIT in 2025. So please, Erik, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, for putting us all together, and thank you to the rest of you too for showing up. I'm just gonna share a few slides to keep you awake here as well. So hopefully you can now see this. Yeah, all good.
Yeah,
All right.
that's great.
So, I'm here to present my book, The World According to Military Targeting, which Patrick just said came out last year, and at MIT Press in the series called Prisms, which is a great series if you want to publish books on war these days. So, the book is, as you can see here, this is the contents. But the book itself is set up as a diagnostic history asking how we ended up in the world made by military targeting for military targeting. It's a world, I contend, in which everything and everyone, everywhere and all the time, is not only potential targets for action, but has already been targeted and are constantly retargeted as new data and reconfigurations engender new relations and makes the world targetable. Starting off from this diagnosis of the present, I'm not only asking in which ways our present is conditioned by the past, but I'm at the same time outlining a research design in which history is used as a means of critical engagement with the present, being attentive at the same time to details, discontinuities, and recurrences in the emerging of a state of becoming. I'm thus not only interested in unearthing the past, but also to crucially reevaluating the emergence of the present, and in particular, the many assumptions and ways of operating that lie at the heart of this condition. Repositioning the past in terms of a present diagnostic allows me, and I think in general, for creating possibilities to reevaluate the past. And for me, this is about military targeting whose meaning and value have largely become solidified within dominant narratives, be they critical or orthodox in nature. To situate targeting in a body of relevant historical trajectories is not only to suggest that it comprises the logical outcomes of these developments. On the contrary, the goal is precisely to suggest that these are not inevitable, but rather a radicalization of various trajectories fused together in a contingent present way. The diagnostic interest here is thus a means to reconceptualize and rewrite history, where the endpoint is not to reconstruct the past, but rather to reconstruct the present. So this diagnostic is a tool through which those of us who are pretty alarmed with the present and future trajectories of martial logics and operations, prompt us to rethink the present epistemological assumptions, concepts, objects, things, and practices, and disrupt these knowledges and their effects. All these chapters are loosely structured around this 2x2 matrix, which the US Marshall apparatus have been using quite recently in the so-called war on terror in exploring the different challenges of the so-called knowns and unknowns. So being loosely structured around this functional practices provides the empirical chapters with an so-called, I guess, artificial matrix through which to analyze military targeting at different historical junctures, engaging directly in what the martial apparatus defines as the problem and how this apparatus attempts to solve it. The matrix is not meant to represent a succession of historical stages, although they are chronological, but rather serve as an analytical lens to distinguish among different analytical problems, the martial epistemologies they rest on, and the ways in which specific configurations are designed to solve these problematizations. So the 4 chapters spans a timescale from the interbellum years through World War II, Cold War, Vietnam War, and the War on Terror, and into the future, with a particular focus on the US military and its wider martial apparatus. Each of the 4 empirical chapters explores how military targeting was configured, how it produced and operationalized the enemy, and how this reconstructed the operational environment, engendering specific transformations in warfare and to what destructive and violent effects. The result in this book is then a exploration that generates multi-layered stories that emphasizes the history of targeting's epistemological present, with a focus on the modes of inquiry into the world that produce and operationalize the enemy, make and destroy worlds. But the book is also an invitation to see beyond the damaged narratives and extend our analysis of violence into further spaces and temporalities. What is at stake here is not only that war and warfare are central to the constitution of social and political orders, or that armed conflict and violence are still ingrained modes of contemporary politics. More importantly, through the seductive forces and formative forces of military targeting, the world is designed for war in ways in which the only rational and logical way of thinking about politics and security is through military supremacy, violence, continuous operation, and global domination. In this world, war becomes the definition of normality and the condition of possibilities for the future. So, but let me briefly now take you into chapter 2 and talk about military targeting as epistemology. But before that, I'm just going to briefly take you into this little strange world of military targeting doctrine. For me, this quote from the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff, the Joint Targeting Doctrine, is quite telling of how they think about targeting, and is key to my understanding of targeting as well. What it states is that a target in itself is not relevant, but it's the relationship to other targets that's relevant for them. And if you look at these diagrams, and the US military loves to make diagrams, we can see that military targeting is fundamentally a distinct relational outlook on the world. Military targeting assumes that the composition and patterns of the world are underwritten by whole part and part-part relations that can be grasped as systems and made knowable through abstraction. Assuming that there's a world out there that exists independently of the means by which the world is abstracted, this is a fundamentally positivist outlook in which reality and the worlds are thought of as accessible and readily available to be discovered through the right means, socio-technical and means of questioning and capture. It's an approach grounded in a kind of realism that assumes that the real emerges from data and that knowledge emerges from the systematization of observations. Through multiple operations of data production, data processing and interpretation, military targeting seamlessly moves and interprets data from generalities to particularities and back again. Being about parts, wholes, and relational ties, targeting defines relationality by homogenizing objects down to their functional relationship to other objects in the system. The result of these operational processes is the emergence of the enemy as an abstract model, a simplified representation of a real-world system, the enemy appears as a coherent entity. Thus, targeting does not compile entities associated with enmity, but it creates and forms the enemy as a coherent entity in non-narrative computational form. From his emergence in the interbellum years throughout World War II and the Cold War, to the urban terrains and jungles of Vietnam, to the mountains of Afghanistan and the desert landscapes of Iraq, and to an imagined future conflict with China, military targeting has for over a century been fundamental to how the military sees the world, imagine war, produce their enemies, assemble their forces, and how they should conduct warfare. In this way, targeting operates as a mode of inquiry into the world, abstracting and bringing into being new actionable worlds. Military targeting was from its infancy, however, always about more than the mere act of seeing, taking aim, firing, and destroying a target. So, contrary to popular and a lot of scholarly understandings of military targeting, it's not simply about tracking or whacking or putting warheads on foreheads, as the US Air Force likes to boast, but a very particular way in which worlds and the enemy is made up. In the book, I move beyond the narrowing of vision of the so-called scopic regimes literature and the aerial gaze, and beyond the genealogies of military vision systems and perceptual practices, to focus on the ways in which the enemy and targets are produced in the first place. By moving the lens from killing to knowing, from perception to cognition, the book brings attention to how imagining the world, producing the world, and operationalizing the world are wholly embedded in socio-technical system and processes. As such, the book advances an understanding of military targeting through the histories of statistical thought and practice and the mathematical and computational techniques used to translate, abstract, and represent the world and its parts as models. Moving targeting towards questions of epistemology shows that the enemy is not the result of a single sensory event or how the world is perceived at any given moment, but rather the recursive cognitive operations. So how is the enemy made up, to paraphrase the late Ian Hacking? Discursively made enemies do not complete with the set of operational procedures and actionable objects through which the military can simply execute its orders and conduct warfare. Armed forces and security professionals also make up their figures of the enemy. How they do so is what I in the book focus on and what I call martial epistemology. By invoking the term martial epistemology, I make an argument about how armed forces and their larger martial apparatus try to make sense of the world, with the aim of imposing order and predictability to the problem of war's messiness and the unruly enemy. Drawing on a range of literatures and theories, from STS to feminist technoscience, media studies, and critical war studies to historical epistemology, I advance in the book in particular onto an epistemological vantage point that argues that what is and what we know is inseparable from how we know and by what means we know it. In other words, ontologies and epistemologies are fundamentally intertwined, such that the thing that comes to matter in the world are inseparable from the concepts, theories, techniques, and instruments used to engage the very same world. Mapping this historically, the book focuses on the material specificities on how things get done, the instruments and techniques and practices that bring things together to produce knowledge. Knowledge that's fundamentally produced with the goal of rationalizing and standardizing war and fix its essence. This means that the emergence of a distinct historical understanding of enmity in the contemporary world of military targeting is contingently dependent on the configuration of various machineries and knowledge production. To capture these martial epistemologies of targeting and its epistemic operations, the book zooms in on how specific historical configurations of humans and machine produce data, turn that data into meaning, turn worlds into models, and models into targets. These models are operational models, activating specific ways through which the military imagines, assemble, and wage war. By focusing on configurations, I'm seeking to capture how humans, technologies, and environment are brought together through design and engineering processes, and what this means for how the world is understood. Bringing intention to how imagining the world, producing the world, and operationalizing the world are always wrapped up in each other and profoundly embedded in socio-technical systems and processes. The chapters inscribe the contemporary world of targeting in a long-standing and concerted martial effort to know and operationalize the world and the enemy. In the book, I draw detailed attention to military doctrine and methodologies, statistical thought and practice, the mathematical and computational techniques of data production, processing, and modeling, and various technologies from human to technical sensors, archives, and punch card devices to the vast databases and machine learning algorithms and the so-called AI of today. Questioning the premises of martial epistemology and its epistemic operations, I believe we can engage with military targeting on its own epistemological grounds. We can open up and articulate the limits of their self-referential, closed-world rationalities through which they justify, juridify, and legitimize their violent practices and undermine their dreams and truth claims by highlighting how their epistemologies are bound up with the histories and politics of domination, power, and violence, and importantly, failure. Failure is important here because all the empirical chapters I show are largely failures to achieve what they wanted to achieve. So let me turn into a little bit of the empirical chapters here. What military targeting is producing, how they view the enemy, is basically down to two things: systems or networks. So in the interbellum years and by the 1930s, a number of techno-scientific trajectories were converging with military thought and practice to enable a doctrinal reimagining of war and the enemy. And this gave rise to what is known as systems warfare. This transformed not only the spatial and temporal rhythms of warfare, but in large part what the enemy could be. This new martial epistemology produced an understanding of the enemy as an industrial system composed of causally interlinked nodes. If effectively destroyed from the air, would lead to a certain material and moral collapse of the enemy. Through scientific and rational calculation, it was believed one would be able to determine a set of targets that would trigger the mechanism that would lead to the predicted military and political end. Understanding this modern state as a complex system of economic and social dependencies, as factories, it was possible to conjure new ways of inducing collapse of the system's capabilities and the will to fight. This was basically a methodological reconstruction of the interconnectedness that held together a modern society and its war machine. And that asked how it could be blown apart. The cementing of targeting as a special discipline during World War II made sure that the industrial age of total war, the enemy was no longer simply a collection of armed forces, but a collection of critical infrastructural nodes. Constructing vast archives of targets and matching them to desired end states, the martial apparatus rearranged the world with devastating effects, turning cities and urban centers into battlefields and warfare into massive slaughter of civilians. Key to linking the enemy to systems or networks was the standardization of formats of data and the multiple and these standardizations was by the 1950s in large part computerized. What you see here is a sample form from what was known in the 1950s as the Bombing Encyclopedia of the World, a massive US undertaking that after the World War II was trying to find all targets of significance in the world. So by the 1950s, the US and with the Bombing Encyclopedia had an alphabetical, a numerical, and geographical index of all possible targets of significance throughout the world, listing hundreds of thousands of such targets. How to abstract the enemy into critical nodes and re-aggregate the nodes into the enemy whole was also the task when targeting was turned towards manhunting in Vietnam and the so-called War on Terror. In the bottom left, or you can see a report form from the famous Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was made to standardize humans into a single file. On the right, you have the so-called baseball cards that were used during the so-called War on Terror, and while that one is a bit more sophisticated, perhaps, it still contains more or less the same information that we can see from the Bombing Encyclopedia as well. So the epistemological problems of targeting will more or less stay the same, and they still the same today. Today, when the US is envisioning a war with China, the targets are only updated with what is believed to be the core functions of modern societies and what they rely on, be that electricity, data centers, satellites, cables, and so forth. But let me dig a little bit deeper into the War on Terror and how the problem of finding unknowns meant to the epistemic operations of military targeting. What we can see from this quote from Mitch Ferry is that the problem with targeting during the War on Terror was insufficient amount of data. They couldn't find unknowns because they didn't have data on the unknowns. So the key to this was a reconfiguration of targeting in which the so-called finish aspect of targeting was not the endpoint, but rather the starting point for producing more data. And to set this in motion, the US military reconfigured its targeting methodologies for global manhunts. The idea was that action would create more data. And to do so, the idea was to fuse the previously separated fields of intelligence and operations. The fusions was designed from a logic that the unknown would only be found if the military is organized in a way that facilitated continuous learning about the enemy and the operational environment. In this worldview, operations would feed intelligence, and intelligence would feed operations. To conjoin operations and intelligence into a seamless whole to facilitate knowledge development, the US military constructed a novel targeting methodology, simply known in military circles by its acronym F3EAD, or FEED, as it's pronounced. The hypothesis here was that by probing the target system, some target elements had to respond, thus providing a signature that could be detected, analyzed, and turned into intelligence concerning the targeting system. This was based on the belief that the threat was out there, but had not yet fully formed or even emerged. So rather than a counterinsurgency logic aiming to preempt or prevent an insurgency from forming, these probing operations was contributing to the actual emergence of the threat. These are modes of producing knowledge about the enemy's system and to learn through constant operations. The problem, however, was that the US Marshall Assemblage believed that there were still things out there that could not be uncovered by searching for known signatures, or simply refused to be forced above detection thresholds of the Marshall sensorium and probing techniques. This was the problem of the unknown unknown. Armed with Clapper's so-called law, the solution to the unknown unknowns was to turn the traditional analysis upside down and reconfigure the Marshall epistemology of military targeting. Rectified through years of experimentation with novel data analytics, computational logics, machine learning algorithm, experimental methods, and organizational reconfigurations and fusions, activity-based intelligence emerged as a novel mindset and methodology in the early 2010s. Unlike signature hunting, ABI does not assume that there are such things as predefined signatures of enmity, a known, but rather that enmity is defined by deviations from the normal. In here, the normal would be redefined as the normal workings of everyday life, digitally remastered, and that which stood out from this normal was that of interest or anomalies in the computational Marshall language. The key thing is that anomaly detection does not operate from any form of predefined, apart from the belief that the irregular is of interest. That which sticks out, is out of place, suspicious, or otherwise curious do not derive from a sense of norm, but rather from deviations purely constructed from data. Such a belief rests on the epistemological logic that anomalies do not stand out of social order, but out of data. A target is then produced not on the basis of the data of a person or object, but rather on the basis of what algorithmic system have learned about others in the environment. The other as anomaly is thus a result of making up the normal. With the US Marshall Assemblage now able to uncover the known unknowns, unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency outlined a grandiose vision to create a continuously replicated virtual version of the entire world, a digital twin called the map of the world. In its 2018 strategy, the NGA laid out a plan to integrate all the diverse data and intelligences to provide the foundation for the layering and synthesizing of intelligence to create a common integrated intelligence picture, accessible anytime, anywhere. A customer-friendly database, they boasted, and a dynamic map, which were to provide no less than a unified online geospatial, temporal, and relational view of the world. And I quote, a living, global, multidimensional digital twin, constantly replicated version of the world, with an activity-based intelligence layer tracking individuals and populations over time and cross-referencing their actions. In this map of the world, different historical configurations of targeting, Marshall epistemologies, and analytical problems combine and fuse to produce the present world of targeting. Based on the mass production and processing of data from the ever-expanding digital ecosystem, military logics and techniques of capture, abstraction, and modeling now iteratively correlate and represent the entire world as fluid sets of relationships in which the enemy and the operational environment are seen as spatio-temporal continuums. The result is a self-sustaining, violent, closed world view, which not only precludes other ways of thinking and acting, but which also, through its operational processes, exclude and implodes alternative possibilities and ways of becoming. This is a world forged in the violent histories, epistemologies, operative logics, and practices of military targeting. Targeting is also ultimately how we come to see ourselves and understand ourselves and our societies. From the mirror imaging after World War II to cybersecurity to critical infrastructure protection, so-called information operations, and to the fears of artificial intelligence today. How we view ourselves through the epistemologies of targeting ultimately have consequences for how we view others and our relationship to otherness. We now live in a world in which war and knowledge feed off and enable each other in ways that fosters the emergence of a global order where targeting is the protagonist. And on that happy note, I hand it over and back to Patrick. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Erik. That was great. Uh, we've got some time for questions from folks in the audience. If anybody's got anything that they'd like to jump in with or to pose, maybe I can jump in at the start. I think reading the kind of the opening of the book, um, or rereading the opening of the book the other day, I was struck by how, rather than kind of centering, I think, kind of the moments of or spectacular or a kind of acute violence, the strike, etc. The book really focuses on how military targeting is a more of a kind of a systematic mode of world making
Mm.
that operates, long before and far beyond the moment of acute violence. And relatedly, I work also in the field of open source investigation, which tends to also focus very much upon the acute episodes, the acute moment of violence, the hyper visible.
Mm.
So I'm wondering kind of what this shift that you make, I think, in the kind of the analytical focus away from the spectacular or the acute towards the systemic or systematic kind of world making of military targeting. I'm wondering how can that kind of reconfigure how we understand kind of responsibility, harm, but also how it could offer modes of kind of resistance or intervention.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this question. I think the to answer this, I think the part of this is how I came to write this book as well. I think I got a little bit I wouldn't say fed up, but I thought the whole killer robots debate about whether humans were in, on, or outside kind of the loop was sort of the wrong approach. I always saw that the human was always kind of in the loop, regardless of the decision kind of to pull the trigger or push the button. Um, of course, that debate is largely an ethico-legal debate about, what is legal or not in terms of, But I was trying here and I think the book also tries to explain that agency is really messy. I mean, there's so many processes that comes before the actual destruction that we need to better understand to actually to see what happens to agency, where power lies, what is violence here as well. So I think that was part of my what I wanted to do here as well, to show that there's these long processes that have uh, really severe consequences, regardless of whether it's a machine or a human which presses the button.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, does anybody want to jump in with a question or a comment?
Hi, can I just speak? Sorry, I wasn't really able to find the hand raise symbol.
Yeah, go for it. Sorry,
Okay,
yeah, no worries.
thanks. Thanks a lot for your talk. I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting. I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about how this is specific to targeting. Like, is there other military operations where this doesn't apply, or what is the thing about military targeting? This is also the title of your book, and of course was present in the talk. But how is that different from other military operations or other aspects of military actions? Thanks.
It's a good question. I think military targeting is fundamental to every military operation. What I'm trying to do here is to think of military targeting more as a way of understanding the world and the enemy. Um, of course, this is a very particular US understanding or a NATO Western understanding of war, which is less focused on territory as such. So the idea is that you can win the war by not engaging particularly armed forces, but you kind of subvert that. You try and you do military operations against kind of key critical nodes, be that humans in a network or particular systems or particular nodes in industrial systems. So, for instance, during World War II, the Brits and the Americans found that the ball bearing factories in Germany was kind of the key node to take out. So they believed that if they managed to bomb all the ball bearing factories in Germany, the whole German war machine would collapse. Of course, that didn't work. But that's the kind of the thinking that that brings out a very particular kind of military operations as well. Of course, there are other operations out there, but at least for the US and NATO countries, this is fundamentally how they think about war and have been for 100 years.
Thanks for that.
Anybody else want to jump in with a question? Yeah, Matt, please.
Hello there. My name is Matt. I'm jumping into this as a ex-soldier who has also written a book on drone war. So I've got a couple, dogs in the game here. So I served in Afghanistan in 2010. I worked in an operations center, and I noticed like sometimes we would conduct strikes on a village, and there would be all this like collateral damage and all this stuff like that, and it seemed to like create the next generation of pissed off people who would immediately rush towards the insurgency. And it became quite like disillusioning for the soldiers on the ground to see this kind of perpetual motion machine that was being created by the kind of ongoing effects of the war. So when you were talking in your talk about this like preemptive targeting in order as like a research tool, I had a little bit of a deja vu there where about this another one of these perpetual motion machines where the sheer act of being in war perpetuates the war. So I wanted to know if you could dig into this idea of the kind of war perpetual motion machine and perhaps unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. Hi, Matt. Thanks for that great question. Yeah, I mean, in large part, the kind of the reconfiguration of the military targeting methodology in the 2010s, at least, towards the F3 EID, which I showed, is largely based on the idea that that data is fundamental to winning war. And the problem is that data is not readily available, so you have to act to produce that data. I mean, the idea here is that I'm not sure about, I mean, you of course you mentioned this. I can't, verify whether a lot of these strikes were simply to produce data, but if you read the doctrines, the methodologies, and the handbooks, this is certainly how they're thinking about it. So I've been thinking about this through Brian Masumi's notion of incitatory power, which is kind of how do you make something emerge? So if you believe that there are enemies out there that are not, they're in the hiding, you need to poke the system in order to make them move, because movement is what makes data. And again, then you can perpetuate this kind of cycle of violence. But it's all, of course, it's never ending as well, because these algorithmic systems that are supposedly to pick up this data, they will always generate one positive answer. If that makes sense.
I'm thinking about some of the kind of AI enhanced human targeting research that I've heard that's happening in, for example, Israel right now, where they're kind of letting the AI choose the kind of hub and spoke system about who gets targeted and who doesn't get targeted.
Mm.
And it has a kind of more ruthless logic than we humans did when we had to make those choices. And it's like, oh, there's one so-called terrorist in a building with 100 civilians. We're just going to level that building and so forth. So you, I don't know, you were kind of like AI isn't changing that much. There's still a human behind it. My wariness about the rise of AI in this role is that it's going to get more ruthless. So
Yep.
think about, you agree? What do you think about the ruthlessness of AI in human targeting?
Absolutely. I mean, what we know of the Israeli systems, the Lavender, for instance, is exactly the same as one was developed by the Americans called Skynet. The Skynet was to follow couriers rather than militants, right? But it's the same algorithmic system, more or less. But of course, I mean, you can speed this up, and it's about looking for particular signatures. So, as far as I understand, the Lavender, they had some 100 behavioral traits on people that were connected to Hamas. And if you have 100 behavioral traits on humans, I mean, everyone is connected to Hamas. So that means that I mean, that allows you to kind of sanitize also kind of the violence you make. So has nothing to do with the language of precision or anything. This is just about mass killings. And it's speeding up. I think, AI allows for the speeding up of all of this.
You talked earlier about we were talking about kind of making the splash in order to collect intelligence afterwards, or provoking a response, and that kind of makes sense to me. For example, if people are listening to the cell phone traffic or some other stuff like that, then maybe they would be able to poach some intelligence. So it doesn't sound like implausible based on the kind of the military mindset. I don't want to monopolize your time here. For example, I think we have kind of good wars and bad wars, or some kind of shade of dodginess between the most kind of unethical ones that are very distasteful and the ones that people, the test of history shows, okay, that one had some ethical basis and sort of needed to happen in order to stop another evil. We have, for example, Russia's aggression in Ukraine right now, and opening up a sort of inevitable war. It's like, what do you do when you've been invaded? You're kind of just stuck. So this typical position of, oh, I wish for a future of in which we all get along just fine, doesn't work if you're being invaded. As a Canadian, we're now getting a lot of aggression, including from our allies in whose war I fought. Side note. What do we do with human targeting? How do we make human targeting work, be somehow ethical in a world where it is the purpose in a just war, somehow occasionally useful and or necessary? Scandalous question. Go, go,
go. Well, I mean, this is, of course, a tough question. I think I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I mean, I think part of the problem here is that we keep on, or the militaries keep on believing in a system that doesn't work. it keeps on producing systems that perpetuates rather than allows them to think strategically. This is largely a tactical operational way of thinking that has kind of taken over from any kind of strategic idea of what war is and how you are supposed to kind of achieve political ends. Um, of course, the problem with the Russian actions in Ukraine and that horrible war there is that it's very different in a sense from kind of how the Americans or NATO would even start thinking about war.
Great. Thanks, Matt, for your questions, and thanks, Eric, for your responses. I think it was Nan next. Please, Nan.
I think I wanted to kind of lead on from a few things that Matt was suggesting in terms of perpetuating the system. And I think, we're always going to have people who deal with conflict living in that epistemological space where the conflict is necessary and they will continue to perpetuate it because that's what human beings do, right? AI is obviously just going to speed this up, as you said. Would there be any way of adding something to that algorithm, whether it's the human way of thinking or the AI way of thinking, to begin to sort of circumvent things or what we're doing with this sort of targeting is creating the enemy. Is there something that can be done within that system to, I don't know, not, prevent the conflict? Because trying to prevent the conflict from the outside as a sort of peacenik, people marching in the streets and, that's good. That's a human thing to do as well. But I think getting into that system, introducing something into that system that will genuinely start to circumvent the conflict maybe would be useful. But is that even possible?
Ooh, that's a tough.
Yeah.
Uh,
Sorry.
no, not at all. I think I mean, in my experience, I've been talking to a lot of military people, and I think that, they are quite open to my critiques. Um, they like to have control, and they also, like Matt, I guess, feel that something is wrong, feel like something is not working with this. So, engaging military personnel, not particularly the high level people because they're a little bit too structured. But I mean, those younger operational people are quite, in my experience, quite accessible to this type of critical thinking. Um, on the other hand, I think, we're now in a position or in the world where, we have the war in Ukraine, we have China, uh, of course, Israel and the US, which is and a massive arms or new tech industry that is
Mm.
feeding off this as well.
Yeah, which of course, yeah, perpetuates it as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of initiatives talking about kind of responsible AI for military and things like that. I think that's long gone. I can't see any of the big tech companies being remotely interested in any kind of responsible AI. But that doesn't mean that, we should try or we should stop trying, right? I think it's really, really important that, people like us do seek to engage in this world as well. But I think that it means that we also need much more technical expertise as well to do this. One thing is the marches, which is great, but I think also that, we need some technical expertise and technical people to actually engage in this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think open source data wranglers are very important as well in that.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in there as well, I think it's another issue though with I think a lot of the open source investigation approaches to looking into kind of AI military targeting. There's been pessimism about this is the removal of the human in the loop, and now the system is completely black boxed, and how do you try and understand that? But I think that's a slightly misguided perception. I think if you look into the infrastructures as well that enable these kinds of technologies, the implications going back to the construction of data centers, the contractual deals between, say, for example, the Israeli military and Project Nimbus with Amazon and others involved in it. There's whilst the acute moment or the moment just preceding the acute moment of violence is perhaps slightly more opaque, or it's less straightforward to attribute blame to that. You can still, there's so much to be drawn out in terms of the infrastructures that enable these technologies as well. And I think that goes back to a point long standing that's been made by Lucy Suchman, that that we shouldn't treat AI as this kind of abstract thing, but it's such a collection of material infrastructures and socio-technical systems as well. So I think OSI work can do really important stuff in that regard as well, is to kind of trace, follow the money in a sense, go back and trace how these systems came into being and how they became operationalized in the first place. So I think that's a potential kind of future site as well. Bernadette, please.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks, Erik, for your talk and also for making your book open access, which I'm deeply grateful for. I wanted to ask you actually about a comment that you made in the opening chapter where you talked about decentering the visual way of war, and wondered if you could say more about that, because, I mean, isn't it the case that we've already done that, or that we do that? So, for instance, yesterday I was looking at an app that the Ukrainians use called e-Vorog, which means apparently enemy. And it's basically a data censoring app that allows ordinary people to collect data and be part of the kill chain using their smartphone to send information to the front line in ways that mean that visual information is not collected by any one part of that chain, but is, distributed, radically distributed now in ways that it hasn't been prior to Ukraine. And so I wondered what you meant by this decentering of the visual way of war, and how that might speak to the kind of, this a very distributive form of targeting that we now see on battlegrounds.
I can't exactly remember where you picked that up, but I think it's related to kind of my friendly critique of the scholarly literature that's interested in, mainly kind of military vision systems. What you see and not see through, for instance, drone feeds and things like this, which has been a large part of how contemporary warfare was studied in late 2010s and upwards. So I'm trying to go back and see I mean, the book is trying to say that, there's more than this kind of the pure visual here. The visual is also created in a very specific way that we need to understand. On the crowdsourcing of intelligence, I think yes and no, but I think there's a lot of people who I mean, me as well. Everyone is kind of complicit in this world anyway, right? So we produce data, and in the sense that if you think about what I talked about, activity-based intelligence, kind of the aggregation of the or producing the normal. So all the data that we are producing is part of creating that normal, and then anything that stands out of that normal is that which the militaries are now also interested in. So in that sense, it's not just the kind of the crowdsourcing, which you mentioned, but it's also that everyone is involuntarily part of the crowdsourcing of target data anyway.
But isn't there still a question around what counts as data in this kind of distributed network as well? I mean, I haven't read the chapter on Vietnam, which I look forward to doing, but obviously Vietnam is the moment where systems analysis comes to be such an important part of how warfare is conducted and is invested in to such a degree that RAND Association does not notice that Vietnam is it's not successful. And when you look back at the kind of acoustic intrusion sensors, for instance, that they were using at the time and how sort of simple they were, it seems odd that we're still so invested in these very narrow conceptions of what actually counts as data.
No, I mean, I mean, you're absolutely right. Data in this world is either that you have predefined signatures of what makes you a suspect, and then you look for those in data. So it could be travel patterns, it could be any connection you have on your phone, or someone has your name in their on their phone. I mean, so there's so many kind of ways of being kind of dragged into this net of suspicion that might warrant a warhead on the forehead, as they like to say. I think this is in Vietnam as well, but in Vietnam, humans were the censors, right? So, but I mean, it was really structured in the way. So they went around in villages with surveys, and they could only answer, they would answer specific questions that was already predefined, because it would work well with the machines that they were using at the same time to make system, or to make synthesis and patterns of that as well. So it's always been very structured. I think what we see now with kind of the AI debate is that the data doesn't need to be that structured, but is even much, much, much more messy.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave space for others to speak now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thanks, Erik. We've got a few questions in the chat, which I can get to now. So Steph says, I have a future-oriented question. She's talking about practice action research. The question is whether Erik and any of those participants, notably those who have engaged in the dialogue, would be open to some strategic use of these screenshots as a mode of multimedia storytelling, potentially seeding transmedia narrative about people who are in some way markedly different from each other, yet still find ways to communicate for a shared common future. I guess maybe that's something where if you reach out to myself and Erik separately, we could certainly talk about that. Then Leia, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. Lots to reflect on. Had a brief question. Seeing that air forces are usually the leading centers for developing doctrines and concepts in targeting, thinking of the relevance of Warden's five rings model in your systems approach, and acknowledging the rise of new modes of delegated targeting, AI enhanced UAVs, for instance, do you see a window of opportunity at the moment in rethinking doctrines based on new grounds?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes and no. The Air Force was particularly important for the kind of the initial development of targeting as a specific discipline. But I mean, in Vietnam, it was more the U.S. Army, and in the so-called War on Terror, it was much more the special operation forces that were kind of reconfiguring the military targeting methodologies as they saw fit. I'm not sure about kind of the window of opportunity to rethinking doctrines. I think, in a sense, the AI enhanced UAVs, yeah, they play a role in the conflict, in a big role in the conflict in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine. But I think that, when the Americans start thinking about China, I think that, we're talking a lot bigger, and a much different way of thinking about targeting. I think that's the way that they plan for that would be to take out Chinese satellites and whatnot, data centers, and disregarding, of course, nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons tend to mess up kind of traditional military thinking. But yeah, so I'm not sure what that question was aiming at, but hopefully there was some thoughts there at least.
Yeah, so well, Nico responding to Nan suggests perhaps using insights from targeting for diplomatic actions rather than military ones. Sorry, the data is going to be here anyway. Nico, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I was reacting to Nana's point about what could be done with that. And I guess the question could be extended to some kind of benevolent use of the targeting technique and those digital twins that are being built for something else than warheads on the foreheads. Did you ever think about what good stuff could actually come out of that as you were studying that?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's several projects ongoing. I mean, Forensics Architecture is a famous group that uses the similar types of data techniques to kind of do forensics on particular strikes. You have other groups that are looking at broader things than economic crimes or environmental crimes using satellite data and things like that. I know that people are using their phones now, of course, a lot more to document. But I think the problem, a lot about the kind of the documenting and the forensics. Part of the problem there is how do it's a post facto type intervention. So yes, I mean, if you look at how A.L. Weissman, who's leading the forensic architecture, he says that these post facto interventions are also a way to kind of using the military technique of probing, right? So if you have these post facto tools, you can force the government or who you think would be kind of have done this, you can force them to kind of respond at least. So you kind of use that post facto intervention to intervene into something bigger. But of course, I mean, I fully support all that. I think it's a brilliant way of doing it, but I'm not sure if that's going to stop. I mean, does it stop the Israelis from conducting genocide? Or I mean, no. But so I think there's also a little bit of that post facto, and I think that's a problem we see now with the international law as well. It's always kind of a little bit post facto, and we're not able uh, to bring that into a way of stopping or stopping war as a useful tool in international politics.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks, Nico. Thanks for your question. So perhaps I think we've got one last question, and then we'll leave it there. We've probably exhausted Erik's question receiving capabilities, but Amara suggests, I'd be curious to hear of the implications of this data-driven targeting for domestic surveillance. Think Imperial Boomerang or the push for facial recognition for policing in the UK. Do we think that's something we should be keeping an eye on?
Absolutely. And Palantir is now designing the instruments for ICE in the US, and they have been hunting people in Afghanistan and Iraq for a decade. So yeah, so I mean, it's absolutely it's the same type of systems. You hunt people based on particular signatures that you don't like, and the kind of the algorithmic systems will definitely find something, and it's designed to find something. So regardless of whether this is valid or not, it'll push out an output, and that output goes to kind of the ICE operatives that run them down. And as far as I understand it, the ICE operatives are also paid by arrests. So yes, there's an interesting economic aspect here as well, in which they are paid more the more they arrest, which of course speeds up things and keeps this system perpetuating as well.
Nan, did you want to just jump in with a final question?
Yeah, just as we've gotten onto Palantir, and of course they're coming into the NHS in the UK as well. When I put a comment about the Nazi Germany building their really sophisticated population census, there was one in the Netherlands previous to that. And in the Netherlands, they were using this really lovely, well-admired social administration system to run the country, and it was great. And of course, when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, they seized this data center, data system that was created for a good purpose, and they used it to really efficiently track down and exterminate the people that they wanted to exterminate. Whereas in other countries, like France, I think didn't have a very sophisticated public administration system. So people in France could hide. They could say, "Oh no, my name is Smith, and I've always lived here." So it wasn't as efficient in terms of exterminating human beings. So I think, yeah, the Palantir and these guys, they're not just Palantir, it's all part of the big picture. And we do need to be really cautious. I'm working in the NHS at the moment and trying to find that balance between the very real, wonderful advances and causes for optimism with things like AI and technology. And then as well, the really, how do we protect ourselves and other people? So yeah, interesting conversation, guys.
Absolutely. And I think, we saw that with with Elon Musk as well. I mean, and his cost-cutting scheme. I mean, he went after the data, the federal data, day one. So he stole a lot of data from the federal governments in that sense as well. So, I mean, yes, data is key here, and I think that it's problematic, of course, that you have companies that specializes in hunting people that are simultaneously working for the NHS or some kind of Tesco or whatever, right? So yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Erik. Really appreciate you taking the time. And thanks everyone else for your great interventions and contributions as well. Yeah, I think we'll leave it at that if that's okay with everyone else. And yeah, thanks again, Erik. I'll be in touch with a form for you to fill in. But yeah, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.